what I really want to get into is the fundamental importance of the causes of mental illness, much as Elenor was raising. And I know we're all feeling very calmed by the charming and beguiling speech of our previous speaker. So it's going to be a real problem for us all to stay awake, I think. Every so often I might have to go, bah! The fundamental causes of mental illness are actually not discussed enough. They're very, very simple, actually. They are urbanization and industrialization. If you look at the international study of schizophrenia, it's never discussed this, but it was done many years ago. It was quite clear that the more industrialized and urbanized you got, the more likely you were to suffer from schizophrenia and the more likely you were to suffer recurrence. We all know that business of going off on our 9 months off or whatever to developing nations and seeing how relaxed and happy everyone looks. They haven't got mortgages. They haven't got a lot of the problems we've got. In developed nations, not nearly enough is made of the basic epidemiology. When you're taught psychology courses, they barely even mention this. And in fact, some leading psychologists actually just get it wrong when they're talking about this. The fundamentals are you're twice as likely to be depressed if you're a woman than if you're a man. You're twice as likely to abuse substances if you're a man than if you're a woman. You're twice as likely to have a mental illness if you live in a rural, in an urban setting than in a rural setting. Many times more likely to be schizophrenic in an urban setting. A very good study in Denmark. And you're twice as likely to suffer from mental illness if your parents were divorced or separated. In fact, Mark referred to the age, the fascinating fact that, it is a fact that as time has gone by since the 1950s, there's been a steady lowering in the age at which people are likely to be depressed. And if you actually look at the ONS studies, of which have been some good big ones of the British population, the curve is pretty straight. The line is pretty straight. That the older you are, the less likely you are to be mentally ill. Just like blip around middle age, but it's the 16 to 24-year-olds who are the most mentally ill. It's also the case, quite good evidence showing that there has been a significant and real increase in the amount of mental illness since the 1950s. This is not simply a matter of Woody Allen's psychobabbling and people being more willing to own up to it. This is based on really good studies. It's also the case, and this has been a major preoccupation of mine in the past, I'm less obsessed with it at the moment, that we are twice as likely to suffer from a mental illness in the English-speaking, what I call selfish capitalist nations, compared with mainland Western Europe. So if you take the WHO study, which is agreed to be a pretty definitive effort, although it's jolly difficult to do cross-national studies of the epidemiology of mental illness, but they have done the best that anybody can. And you find that the average for the 6 mainland Western European nations is 11.5%. And then depending how you juggle the figures, admittedly, but if you just look at the USA and New Zealand, the average for them is twice that. And indeed, in almost every study that's ever been done, there is the most mental illness always in the USA. In the WHO, it's 26.4%, easily the most bonkers nation on earth. Surprise, surprise. My argument regarding that has been that the English-speaking nations are the ones that have been afflicted by Thatcherism, Reaganomics, free market economics. In other words, political economy has had a very considerable effect on our mental health. And I believe that a key factor in that is our materialism. Tim Kasser and his colleagues evidence that if you are too materialistic, you're more likely to suffer. In other words, materialistic meaning placing too high a value on money, possessions, appearances, or fame. You're much more likely, statistically significantly more likely to suffer from the commonest problems: depression, anxiety, personality disorder, substance abuse. And there are various mechanisms by which that works. So, for example, the fact that we all get into so much debt is certainly one of them, that we have a very debt-laden system compared with mainland Western Europe. We have had for 50 years, the mainland Western Europe has had 4 times less money spent per capita advertising at that population. In other words, 4 times more in America, twice as much more compared with mainland Western Europe in the UK. Obviously, my colleague Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett have pointed out to great effect that inequality is a major consequence of selfish capitalism, and that seems to be a significant factor in prevalence of mental illness. There are contrary arguments to what I'm saying, that is the case that I'm making, that it is the political economy that's so damaging. For example, you can argue that individualism and collectivism, levels of those, are very significant. Asian countries generally have much lower prevalence of mental illness. The more they're infected with Americanized free market capitalism, the more mentally ill they get. But it's also true that their levels of collectivism drop. And the individualism of the Americans is undoubtedly part of why they're so bonkers. But it's interesting, though, that in the case of Japan, I mean, there are huge differences, if you actually look cross-nationally, in the prevalence of mental illness. And a particularly striking example in the WHO study is that you're something like 50 times more likely to suffer from impulsive aggression in America than you are than in Japan. So I'm getting through this quite quickly because I don't think some of you may be aware of these ideas that I have, and I don't want to dwell on them for too long. But I want to be clear that there is a big picture to the prevalence of mental illness, and if you want to solve the problem of mental illness, you need to change society at a fundamental level. If we simply had the kind of political economy they have in Denmark, you would probably have about half as much mental illness here as a result. We live in a shop till you drop. It could be you, credit-fueled, consumer junkie kind of society. The question, though, that preoccupies me much more nowadays, and what has always fascinated me anyway, is why is it that one sibling is more at risk of mental illness than another? Now, the findings of the Human Genome Project, I wonder how many of you are aware of them. There seems to be an extraordinary ignorance of them. What they show, if you look at studies of genome-wide association studies, is that at most 1 to 5% of the variants can be found in gene variants. 1 to 5%. So if I give you an example, and these studies are incredibly well funded, have been going on now for a considerable period of time. And to give you a particularly startling recent example, there were 114,000 subjects who didn't have schizophrenia and 36,000 who did. And they looked at their genes in massive detail. The results, that when the study was published, the publicists of the study managed to get it onto the Today programme. And this is part of why many of you will have been misled, because the Today programme and the BBC in general, science portions of the BBC, keep pumping this message out. The BBC, the Today programme, when it covered this study, described it as a huge breakthrough. But if you actually looked at what the study showed, what it showed was, this huge study showed that only 3.4% of the variance was explicable through genetic variants. In other words, if you took the study on its merits, 96.6% of schizophrenia is not caused by genes, it's caused by something else. But this is apparently a huge breakthrough. It was presented as a huge breakthrough because they'd found they had 108 variants, of which about 2/3 were replicated. And they got very excited, and they've indeed, the Today program has reported other studies which are similar, which seem to be creating an absolute shambles in terms of the DSM, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, in that it's showing that there are variants basically which apply to pretty well which overlap with all the different mental illnesses. And in fact, the most recent account of this by the leading schizophrenia geneticist, molecular geneticist, is saying that actually everybody's got the genes for schizophrenia. So, sorry, what does that mean? My position is, and I've talked off the record to many molecular geneticists, and they admit that they are not going to find the genes for anything. It is very clearly the case. It'll be in 2-3 years' time, whole genome sequencing will be done, where you've got 3 billion SNPs which can be looked at, and it'll be shown beyond peradventure, that there's nothing different about the genes of people who are mentally ill from the people who aren't mentally ill. And it will be impossible to go on arguing about it. That will be end of. Except for the fascinating thing is, what will it take for people to accept the null hypothesis? You may say this is just, I don't know how familiar all of you are with this literature. You may say that this is just a distorted, prejudiced account of the literature. It's not. What I'm telling you is actually the accepted wisdom, insofar as I'm telling you that they can only find 1 to 5% of the variance. That's just a fact. And in order to deal with that fact, the way the genetically minded people have dealt with it is by positing something called the missing heritability, or it was first of all called the DNA deficit. This is, of course, because there is a huge gulf between the findings of some twin studies, not all twin studies, and these molecular genetic findings. There's going to come a point where they're going to have to stop talking about a missing heritability. They're going to have just have to say the genes aren't there. There aren't any genes. That what I say is the case. Look in The Guardian, on the Guardian website, look at the interview with Robert Plomin. Robert is the main man when it comes to gene psychology. And you will see him quoted as saying, "I've been looking for these genes for 15 years. I don't have any. I've been looking for these genes for 15 years. I don't have any." That's by Robert Plomin. Furthermore, you can see the extent to which geneticism is a faith, even by someone as honourable and as admirable in many ways, to my mind, Robert Plomin. When Robert is asked at the end of the article, what will you do when they've looked everywhere, when they've looked in the attic, under the bed, absolutely everywhere, and they pretty much have already, and they're still finding nothing, he said, quote, "I will still believe that heritability is true." That is not science, that's faith. As Elenor mentioned absolutely rightly, of course, there are differences in our brains when we go between different states of mind. Of course, that's right, that if you are in mourning, everything we know would suggest that if you did a study of people in mourning versus people not, or before and after, you would find differences in their brain. But this is so irrelevant. This is not the point. The point always is cause. As Elenor put it, it is in fact a no-brainer. As she also intimated, childhood experience is extremely important. So yes, I come from very much the Frankfurt School of Psychology, in which you look at the broader socio-economic, political economic factors in causing mental illness, but you're also a Buddhist, if you're from that school of thought, Eric Fromm, but you are also very much preoccupied with how the early years are affecting your adult personality. And on this point, it cannot be recited often enough, the poem by Philip Larkin, This Be the Verse. They fuck you up, your mum and dad. They may not mean to, but they do. They fill you with the faults they had and add some extra just for you. But they were fucked up in their turn by fools in old-style hats and coats who half the time were soppy stone and half at one another's throats. Man hands on misery to man. It deepens like a coastal shelf. Get out as early as you can and don't have any kids yourself. Which is, some very clever person pointed out to me, in fact, the last two lines are a double entendre. So if you do get out as early as you can during sex, if you're the man, you won't have any kids yourself. The evidence regarding the extent to which they fuck you up, your mum and dad, is stacking up on a grand scale. And that's, contrary to what is often said, actually the amount of money that's been spent on looking for psychosocial causes of all mental illness is vastly less than looking for biogenic causes. But despite that, enough research has been done, considerable amounts. And it starts, of course, prenatally. There are a number of prospective longitudinal studies which show that a woman who is stressed during the final trimester of pregnancy is likely to have high levels of the hormone cortisol, the fight-flight hormone that's secreted in response to threat. And consequently, the baby is more likely to be born more difficult. Consequently, when those samples have been followed all the way through to ages as late as 10, they're, for example, twice as likely to have ADHD when all the other confounding factors are taken out of the equation. There's an interesting body of literature coming out now about autism, because if genes are really not causing things, and all of us perhaps know somebody who's had a child with autism, I certainly do, and I know that their parents didn't do anything bad to that child. I'm quite sure that child was born with something wrong with its brain. But I am also pretty convinced that what it is what happens during the during the pregnancy, although, of course, one should always remember when thinking about the genes matter that, of course, there might be something else that we just have never even thought of. The history and philosophy of science, if we know anything, should teach us to be very modest. Just because it's not in your genes doesn't mean there isn't some other method of transmission that we've never even heard of. But for the time being, staying in the realms of what we do know about, it is interesting, although there may be many explanations for it, but there's been a considerable rise in the prevalence of autism, or at least many experts in the field say so. And there has also been a considerable rise in the proportion of pregnant ladies being given antidepressants. Now, insofar as antidepressants work, which, as we know, they hardly do, and frankly, saying that CBT is, or anything, is nearly, is as effective as antidepressants is not terribly reassuring. We know from Irving Kirsch's work that only about 25% of the impact of antidepressants is, once you take into account all the hidden studies that the drug companies don't show. When you take that into account, only about 25% is some kind of active chemical ingredient, the supposed serotonin-raising component. But I digress. Going back to the autism, it seems that very possible, there is real plausible mechanisms and plausible theories here and plausible evidence that some of the rise in autism could in fact be caused by increased serotonin secretion in pregnant ladies. I'm not going to go into enormous detail, but it's worth just all of us noting the extent to which the very earliest period, the 0 to 2-year-old period, has now been sufficiently well studied to show that lack of responsiveness of care, lack of love, as Sue Gerhardt puts it, quite simply, but responsive love particularly, is related to all sorts of psychological outcomes for infants and toddlers, but also can be measured in things like dysregulated cortisol, abnormal left frontal lobe functioning, etc. There are a load of studies I can point to which show that, there's not nearly as many as there should be. If we'd spent the money, I'm pleased that the Human Genome Project has finally ruled genes out. But on the other hand, now, time to start spending the money on the large-scale prospective longitudinal studies done in lots of different countries. And they've spent something like £8 billion looking for the genes. Let's spend the same amount of money now looking at what precisely it is about child experience that precisely has which outcomes. And at the moment, though, we do know, for example, from the best study there's been, which is the Minnesota study by Alan Sroof and colleagues, that care responsiveness 0 to 2 correlates very strongly with dissociation at 19 and 30. So dissociation being a key indicator of all sorts of things, but obviously a personality disorder, and points west from that on the degree to which you're moving towards psychosis. There are a long time ago, a great study done in Czechoslovakia where they found a large sample of women who'd been refused back in the day, in the Soviet Union days, women could be refused abortions. And they found a whole load of women who'd been refused abortions who'd come back twice to try and get abortions on a baby and been refused, and then looked at the outcomes. Unwanted those babies were, and indeed they suffered all sorts of adverse consequences just from that crude measure. There's another study which just measured negativity of the mother in the first month, and they were 18 times more likely to be insecurely attached at age 40. And as we know, insecure attachment correlates with a whole lot of problems, with most mental illnesses. We also know from Quinton and Rutter's study a long time ago that adoptees who have suffered, by definition, almost a difficult early life, and then have had a more or less unsatisfactory time in institutions before they get adopted, that they are, that inadequate or unresponsive parenting in the first 2 years is an independent variable in their study for predicting personality disorder in later life. I could go on. I'll mention one last study, the first one, which very recently came out, where there was a straight correlation between 18-month-old insecurity and inadequate brain processing of positive information at age 22. The first study to actually link early experience with changes in the brain in later life. My point about all that is that the model, the traumagenic model that John Reed is so helpfully put forward and is now, I think, going to take centre stage for many, many people as time goes by. I think that you've got to think of it as in terms of it starts in the womb, and then the child is born, and then a whole lot of things happen to it. And as Sroof, as Bowlby, as many other people have talked about, the branching method, the branching model, that you can go in lots of different directions depending on what happens next. But that you are, because of the experience you've had, you are more likely to head in certain directions. At a very simple level, you've had a bad time as a child, you're more likely to head off towards the bad boys when you get to school, for example. You get in with a bad set. All this nonsense about that there was a fashionable book 15 years or so ago that said that genes are crucial, parents are completely irrelevant, and Judith Harris's book, and that the only thing that mattered in the environment was peers. What a load of rubbish. It turns out that when you actually look at it in detail, that the sort of peers you get are as a result of the sort of childhood experience you've had. The SRU study, I think, is particularly significant because he followed 267 at-risk children all the way through. And when they got all the way through, I think they had about 180 left, which is a reasonable number. And they found that 90% of the children who had suffered some kind of maltreatment were qualifying for a mental illness at age 18. 90%. And I think that when the problem has been that the prospective longitudinal studies have not looked at everything, but you've got to look at maltreatment across the board. You can't just look at whether there's physical abuse or whether there's sexual abuse. You've got to look at whether there's emotional abuse, which is coming through as being incredibly important. You've got to obviously look at neglect. You've got to look across the piece and more subtle things than that too. Those are very crude measures in themselves. When you do look at everything, as SRUF is the nearest to that we've had, you find this, in fact, that the vast majority, exactly as John says, as Elenor points out, if bad stuff is done to you, it pretty much invariably has bad outcomes. Resilience is a dream that was dreamt up to try and keep the genetic myth going about 25 years ago. It's just rubbish. Again, I don't think resilience exists. The idea that some children are born, able to survive, terrible maltreatment, I think is very doubtful. The classic, some of the people here may want to raise gene-environment interaction evidence. Caspi's study, Dunedin, the one that started the whole 5-HTTP serotonin theory. So many non-replications that is not standing up. There is a debate about that, but it's not standing up. And that study, when I first read it, the bit about it that I found very suspect was that they said that if you had the particular variants of genes, which meant that you would have lots of serotonin, as opposed to the variant which meant you had low serotonin, and were therefore vulnerable. If you had the healthy variant, it didn't matter at all how nasty your parents were to you, and that to me sounded very, very dodgy, and I don't think that will ever stand up. And I think equally, I think that when really good prospective longitudinal studies are done, I suspect what we'll find is that very, very few people become mentally ill who had a good first 6 years. What I'm saying is basically that the first 6 years establishes your electrochemical thermostat. Bad things after that can happen to you. As John Reed pointed out, there's plenty of evidence that you can, for example, you can be raped, and that can really change the direction of your life. But the evidence shows in terms of sexual abuse that the earlier it happens to you, and the more that it's the closer the more it's closer to a biological relative, and the more penetrative the experience, the worse the outcome. There is good evidence for that, but it's dose-dependent. There's dose-dependent evidence for all of this. The more maltreatment, the worse you turn out. And exactly as Elenor said, it does have effects on your brain. It affects, that there's plenty of evidence from Taisha that and others that a woman who was sexually abused on average has 5 to 15%, depending which studies, which bits of the brain, less of things like the amygdala, the hippocampus. So these experiences in later life, but you're particularly fragile and vulnerable in younger life because your brain's still growing, but in later life, very important too. So what am I saying? I'm saying the kind of society we live in has a big effect, and I'm saying however toxic, whether you're in America or in say Nigeria, where they have 6 times less mental illness than in America, interestingly. Even in America, the kind of childhood experience you have creates a greater or lesser vulnerability to the toxicity of that environment, and individual difference interacting with the social system. So what's the answer, Gov? Well, as far as I'm concerned, that obviously I'm going to stick to some to one or two simple points. One is therapy. Okay, now, I do not in any way wish to dispute that mindfulness is going to be very helpful, and I think particularly helpful in, exactly as Mark says, in preventing relapse. But I am very uncomfortable with a model which does not allow for the possibility of cure. And I do completely part company with David Clarke, Mark's colleague, about this, as I do with him about the value of CBT. The value of mindfulness, I'm right with you on that. I'm speaking as someone who for 27 years has done 10 minutes yoga in the morning and evening, and I'd be a very different person if I hadn't, I'm quite sure of it. I know that it has had a very beneficial effect on me. Its capacity to help my patients, I get all my patients doing it, but its capacity to really do the job, well, I'm only talking about yoga, I'm not just talking about, obviously mindfulness is a more specific, specialized application. But I am slightly skeptical about that. And I'm really skeptical about whether it can achieve a cure. Now, put mindfulness to one side. Where I get really heated is about CBT. I think that the claims that have been made for CBT have been, frankly, outrageous and excessive, because I can forgive the person who created IAPT, Richard Layard. He's an economist. I was part of the Happiness Forum that he originally created, and he then drifted off into happy clappy land, and we haven't parted company, and I think his book on happiness is beautifully written, but I think he grossly exaggerates it, and I'll come back a bit later to what I think about happiness. But his espousal of CBT, I don't know whether he's read the papers. I can't believe that David Clarke hasn't. And if you actually read the scientific evidence, and you can look at it on my website, there is really strong evidence that CBT does not work in the sense that it does not provide a cure. At best, it ameliorates symptoms. And I say at best because we all know lots of people who are extremely fed up with having been offered CBT. It's an incredibly irritating thing to be given to anyone who's very intelligent or aware. I have many friends who've been offered CBT and who find it incredibly irritating to basically say that black is white. I'm also extremely skeptical about what you can achieve in 6 sessions. I do think that it is just essentially a form of kind of mental hygiene, elastoplast, if you like, in which you're really just being encouraged to change your thinking. You tick the boxes at the beginning, you tick the boxes at the end. The IAP system says you've improved, but have you really improved? I really don't think so, in most cases. And indeed, the scientific evidence, as I say, is against it. And I have had exchanges with the key players in this, of people like Peter Fonagy and Clarke, and I've said to them, provide me with the evidence for long-term efficacy, because there's a lot of evidence against it. There are 2 reviews, Drew Weston's review, Jonathan Shedler's review, which say, no, it doesn't work in the long term. Compared with controls, they do not do any better. They may do better than people who've taken antidepressants or as well, but that is not the question, as is well known by these scientists. So if you actually look at the long-term evidence, if you look at Rob Durham's study, for example, which is a big study of 369 patients followed up 2 to 14 years after treatment, I quote what he said, CBT was not associated with any significant differences compared with people who had no CBT in terms of diagnostic status or clinical global severity. Over half the participants had at least one diagnosis at long-term follow-up, irrespective of treatment received, and few participants had none or only mild symptoms, only 18%. So my point is that I really do think we need to get out of this model which is being touted around by the clinical psychologists and the CBT proponents, that basically what they're really saying is depression and anxiety. I mean, if you read David Clarke's book, Thrive, he and Richard Layard claim that it is still the case, they stick to the idea that these things are about 50% genetic. That is based on twin studies. Twin studies are going to have to, twin studies are going to have to be dropped as something we talk about because the molecular genetic evidence is blowing them away. Leave aside all the debates that Jay Joseph and I have raised about the problems with twin studies, the key one being, of course, that you have to make, if you're comparing identical with non-identicals, you have to make what's called the equal environments assumption. You have to make the assumption that the identicals are being treated as similarly by their parents as non-identicals. A ludicrous assumption. Anybody who's had anything to do with identical twins knows that their parents can't tell them apart half the time. So of course they get treated more similarly, and indeed the evidence shows that it is, and a sort of Lakatoshian belt is then wrapped around. They say, well, all right, fair enough, they are treated more similarly. But the reason for that is because their genes, their psychological genes, not their physical appearance, their genes are causing them to be treated more similarly. A tautology, if ever you heard one. And they'll take it to the distance. They'll take it to include sexual abuse. They're more likely to be both sexually abused because of because of their psychology, not because of what they look like. So it's very, very dodgy, that. And I think, frankly, that twin studies are going to be blown away. And I think that my prediction will be that at some point, eventually, if he hasn't destroyed all the evidence from the Minnesota twins reared apart study will eventually be shown to be spurious. It's a very dodgy body of evidence, in fact. So what I would put in its place, I would say there is very good evidence that therapies which do explore childhood history and do look at causes do work in the long term. Read the evidence. The evidence is there, not referred to in Thrive at all. Thrive dismisses, well, very specifically chooses its words. It says psychoanalysis has not been proven. No, it hasn't. But psychodynamic psychotherapy, there are good reviews of the evidence which show that it does work in the long term. That is, it is a cure. And I personally practice as a psychodynamic psychotherapist, and I'm not going to, but I could wheel in patients who I have cured. They are no longer depressed and have not been depressed for years. And there are that's true of many psychodynamic psychotherapists. Don't get me wrong, I know psychodynamic psychotherapists can be rubbish, and also I know that CBT has taught me, and also them, a good deal, the ones who are prepared to listen, in terms of taking responsibility and feeling that at the end of the session they've got to have actually done something to make this person better. The old psychoanalytic model, you came 5 days a week and nobody bothered. But what I'm saying is that what we need now is to get into finding therapies which explore the childhood roots of all mental illness, and then find the ones that work, ditch the bits that don't, and frankly stop this elastoplast. Yes, let's have IAPT, but let's have talking therapies that actually are going to fundamentally cure, as opposed to patch people up and send them off to Tesco's to work as a checkout person with a smile on their face, which is basically what that IAPT was sold to Gordon Brown as being something that it would do. The other thing I want to talk about on practical terms for you in your lives is, both as practitioners and in your lives, is office politics. And I can't express this better than by a story that is told of the CEO of the largest business in a town, and he's visited by a charity worker. And it's come to our attention that neither he nor his company have ever contributed anything to charity. She asks if he'd like to do so. He replies, "Did you know that I have a divorced sister with 4 children and no money?" "Oh dear, I'm so sorry to hear that." "Did you know that I have 2 elderly parents requiring 24-hour care?" "Gosh, no, that's awful." "Did you know my ex-wife looks after our severely disabled son requiring expensive medical equipment?" "Oh, gosh, how awful." "If I don't contribute any money to support any of them, what makes you think I'm going to start giving money to charity?" That sums up the ruling elite of our society at the moment. The problem is they are the ruling elite. So my brief points about office politics are to say, and I must be brief, that this ruling elite there are good studies showing that they have a triadic psychology. The triad of psychopathy, narcissism, and Machiavellianism. And of course, not all of them do, and I've met many that don't, but a significant proportion do. So for example, a CEO in America is 4 times more likely to qualify for a Robert Hare diagnosis of psychopathy, 4 times more likely than the general population. There's a lovely study of senior managers in this country which showed they used as the comparison group ordinary inpatients at a mental hospital and patients at Broadmoor. And of the, whatever it is, 16 categories of personality disorder, on 4 of them, the senior managers came higher, of which, of course, narcissism was one. Understanding, is it still working? Yeah. Understanding that psychopathy, narcissism, and Machiavellianism are rife at the top of your organisation, and indeed your peers, if you look around you, who are competing with you to get to the top, is actually very helpful. And there are also, we can go into this in more detail if you want to know why. But for example, to give you one simple example, if you spot that you actually have got somebody who's primarily psychopathic, because people on that spectrum vary as to how much they're one of the 3 categories. But if it's somebody who's basically primarily a raving narcissist, it's amazing what you can achieve through ingratiation. If, on the other hand, they're primarily a psychopath, you probably want to get the hell out of there as quickly as you can. And the other point I just want to make about office politics for your own survival is that, particularly amongst the caring professions, people like to think of themselves as that's not for me, that's for everyone else. I don't do that. Well, 1 in 5 of our communications contain an untruth. So you're lying to yourself if you say that you never lie. But also, wake up and smell the coffee. The fact is that, of course, all of us have to manipulate in order to get our way. When we were up against our siblings as children, of course, we did try to get our brothers and sisters into trouble and sneak off. In other words, we live in we now live in an environment where the vast majority of us, so 90% of us, are in service sector employment. And in that environment, whether you're employed in the first place, how much you're paid, and subsequently whether you're promoted, depends totally, in most cases, on what your boss thinks of you. And there's no very objective metric by which this can be measured. Once upon a time, you made a certain numbers of widgets a day, you were paid a certain amount per widget, and at the end of the day, you got paid a certain amount of money. It's not like that now. And in a system where you've got sliding scales and moving metrics, you're going to have people around you who take credit where it's not due and try to pass the blame for their mistakes onto you. So it's an environment where you need to be, as I say, you have to get better at office politics. My final point is just a brief comment on where are we trying to get to. And I can tell you where we're not trying to get to. I don't think we're trying to get to mental health. Mental health is basically just defined as the absence of mental illness. I don't even think, despite the title of my talk, that we're trying to get to sanity. I know plenty of examples of people who are ostensibly very sane, but who are incredibly boring and lifeless and not mindful and not very playful either. Sanity isn't something that I would hold up as the goal. If I had to hold up a goal, and here we can perm any of many, you've all probably got just as good ideas as me, but the things that I pick out for the sake of throwing this forward, because I do see this as incredibly important, that the future of psychology, one of the reason we're in this mess to a large extent, the reason that something like Thatcherism could happen was because people of my generation did not actually provide answers. We were dominated by the legacy of Freud, who, in terms of answers, the best he's got to offer is neurosis is the rule, not the exception. Marx, who was completely useless on the subject of what was going to happen come the revolution. Karl, what's it going to be like? He's got practically nothing to say on the subject. Erich Fromm made an attempt to try and extract a version, Marx's concept of man, tried to get a picture of what Marx was talking about in terms of the human being we were looking for, which is much more about what Fromm had to say than actually what Marx ever said. Darwin's got nothing to say on the subject of where we're going. And then you can have people like Durkheim and Weber, who are very influential for me, but none of them have got anything to say about where are we trying to get to, either as a society or as individuals. And along comes Richard Layard and says, happiness is where we're trying to get to. Forget it. As far as I'm concerned, happiness is an absurd aspiration. You're bound to fail if you place that as your goal. I think it's actually really just pleasure. It's the pleasure you might get after having a fag or having sex or a drink. I don't think we were put on this earth to be happy. For God's sake, we're British. How could we buy into this nonsense? Whereas I would suggest to you as an ideal type, and this is something that nobody will ever achieve, I suspect, all the time, 6 things: living in the present, first-hand experience, mindfulness, fluid two-way communication, so neither jammed on transmit nor jammed on receive, neither like someone on coke nor like someone on diazepam. So you're somebody who can actually listen when it's your turn to listen, but also when it's your turn, when you've got something to say, can get out there and say it. Not easy to do. Insight, which I, as referred to in the slide earlier, is absolutely crucial. It's spotting you're about to crash the car and turning the wheel, not always crashing in the same car. Actually being able to understand that something from your past has been stirred up in you, and that's why you are suddenly reacting very adversely to this person at work, or why you're suddenly disproportionately over and inappropriately attracted to this other person, whatever it is. Insight is the key, that can turn the lead of pathology into the gold of emotional health. Fourthly, real playfulness. I'm lucky enough to have a 13-year-old and a 10-year-old. I'm constantly, loving their playfulness. They help me to be playful. It's just a joy to behold. It also makes me weep to see how playfulness, the playfulness of us as children, is destroyed ground down by the drudgery of our selfish capitalist lives. And I'm obviously talking about playfulness. I'm not talking about, game playing. Fifthly, vivacity, as opposed to the hyperactivity that we all suffer from. Vivacity is always going to be good for you. And finally, authenticity as opposed to sincerity. And I think there is an important distinction that Lionel Trilling wrote a famous book called Sincerity and Authenticity. Essentially, sincerity is another way of explaining it is just being American. So it's because you feel something strongly, you somehow believe that justifies it. It's Tony Blair saying, I felt it was the right thing to do to invade Iraq. That was his explanation. Sorry, Tony. Authenticity is something quite different, and I think the literatures, people like Richard Ryan provide the best accounts of it. It has to do with self-determination. It's being real, it's being true, it's as solid as stone. And those 6 things, now you may have other ones. Wisdom would certainly be another alternative. There are lots of ways of talking about this. There's not nearly enough research into it. Psychology has failed miserably to come up with a proper account of something that's really worth going for, that's a little bit more interesting and exciting than mental health, happiness, or sanity, and actually a bit more of ambitious. When you come to think of the big picture, you've got to remember, I'm old enough to have remembered what life was like before Thatcher. And if you told me in 1979 what was about to happen, I would have laughed in your face. It was a radical shift in which, within a very few years, people were becoming more and more obsessed with money, obsessed with entrepreneurialism, business, blah, blah, blah. When I left university, People wanted to be lecturers, they wanted to be social workers, things like that. Monty Python had only recently been taking the piss out of accountants. Anybody who left university, when I left university, said they wanted to be an accountant, everybody would have been appalled. So something as radical as Thatcherism can happen. And then in 1989, something as radical as the Soviet Union disappearing in a puff of smoke. People forget this, you see. They forget how big the changes can be and how quickly they can happen. Soviet Union, all my life, everybody in my generation had pictured the mushroom cloud. We lived in fear of atomic war. And suddenly, the Soviet Union disappeared. And nobody predicted it, to the best of my knowledge. More recently, we've had Arab Springs. You can have the most phenomenal changes can occur. If those sorts of things can happen, massive changes can occur in societies for the better. So it's not just, I think, a pipe dream to suppose that we could have a phenomenal and radical and rapid shift in our values and the way we see the world. Elenor was mentioning the fact that there is no money in the world of austerity. This austerity is something that's been imposed on us, as we all know. 1% of the British landmass is owned by the Ministry of Defence, okay? There are so many things we could do to get hold of money to pay for this sort of incredibly valuable work. What I'm saying is we need prevention. What we need is a society which is primarily focused on ensuring that the needs of small children are as much as possible met by their parents, in my opinion, not by substitutes, but by their parents. A society that sets up that possibility and backs it to the hilt. Costs a lot of money, but we could easily afford it. And if we did it, if we put that ahead of the profits of a tiny few, as we've heard with the HSBC fiasco recently, blah, 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 if we went ahead with that and did it, I believe you really could, now that we know that it's not in your genes, I believe we could truly eradicate, to a very large degree, mental illness, and we could, to a large degree, eradicate poverty. And indeed, in Scandinavia, to a large degree, they have. Only 7% of the Danish population are on a low income. I think, on a practical level, that we need to ditch CBT, pretty well wholly, and replace it with what I would call real therapy. We need a campaign for real therapy, which needs to be evidence-based. We need a political economic system which forces businesses to actually ultimately serve the employees and the communities and not just a tiny few rich people. Now, okay, you could say dream on, but remember what I said. Thatcherism happened, Soviet Union happened, Arab Springs happened. With disastrous consequences in many cases, but massive change. And there are plenty of examples of massive changes for the better. Look at what happened in the UK in 1945. An incredible change occurred in which we had a health system set up, an education system set up. We sensibly nationalised a lot of public utilities, which is what they still should be. And there's no reason why all that can't happen again. In the meantime, okay, we have to just carve out niches of emotional health for ourselves in what is essentially rather a mad society. And to a large extent, I'm afraid, the best I can offer you in terms of a temporary handbook for dealing with our affluenza-stricken materialistic society is office politics. And in the words of the Tears for Fears song, rejuvenated by Funboy 3, it ain't what you do, it's the way that you do it. It ain't what you do, it's the way that you do it. It ain't what you do, it's the way that you do it. That's what gets results. Thank you.